preface to the Zohar. The Sulam was a commentary on the Holy Zohar. And he says the following. He says, to be worthy of redemption, one must be pashut, free of external connections. If you look at the footnote, it says the word pashut or pashut means, the Hebrew word means simple or straight. It's something also that's not compounded. It doesn't, it's not combined with other things. It's not connected with other things. So what he's saying, it's bereft, it's from being tied down to anything else. There's a complete independence, but it's also complete simplicity. But it's interesting because it's a language that's used in reference to God, God's light, so to speak, his revelation, in other words. So it doesn't mean simple in the sense of like a child. It means simple in the sense that it's not a composite of many things, that there's absolute harmony. That's in terms of God. But in terms of what we mean here is that it's not interdependent on anything else. So, and look, we really touched on this many times, the idea, I believe so anyway, that the idea of choice, the idea of real independence is being free of one's selfish interests and desires, because those aren't really who we really are. In other words, whether a person is being pulled by his ego or some type of physical pleasure, pulling him in a certain direction, and if the person gives into that, that's not self-expression from a Judaic perspective. That's its own form of enslavement. Person is giving in, is surrendering to that feeling and so on. That's not pashut. That's not independence. Independence is listening to the neshama, is listening to the soul, and walking the ways of God, because God is the ultimate independence. So the closer you are to him, the more independent you truly are. But in a more simple sense, the idea is that, as I said, our true essence is the soul, and to make the choices that are morally and spiritually in line with God's will, that's real independence. But I mean, in a simple sense, the point is when a person can follow their intellect and not be washed away in their feelings, then they have real independence. They can objectively, using their reason, make decisions and not just follow the way they feel at the moment. And we all understand that being a person who's follows uncontrollable feelings, whether they're anger or lust or selfishness, greed, whatever it is, they're all unhealthy, and they all are a form of addiction of one kind or another. In any event, what we're talking about here is, this is really a continuation from the paragraph before, which is talking about the liberation of Egypt. I was talking about that the ger or Noahide should have a feeling that they go out of Egypt. It's one of the commandments that an Israelite is obligated to keep. They should feel that they themselves went out of Egypt. And what he's saying here is that the idea of the ger, which relates to every Noahide, whether they fully converted or whether they accepted on some of the 7 laws, is the idea of exiting, of exodus, of leaving the restrictions and darkness and so on, and having a form of a redemption, and recognizing that redemption comes from Hashem, comes from God. And so this is a continuation of that idea. I mean, he actually went so far in the previous paragraph as to say that the ger should celebrate the Seder, and and they also should feel that they also went out of Egypt, that they accompanied the Jewish people out of Egypt. Their neshamas were there, I guess he's saying. So again, it has to do with the idea that the Jewish people were strangers in the land of Egypt, and so their experience relates to the experience of the ger, of the stranger. Okay, so to continue, we're saying that the Sulam, the commentary in the Zohar, tells us that the purity of being pashut, of being simple and bereft of all types of biases, in other words, and different being pulled in different directions, renders a person fit as an instrument of redemption. A person becomes an instrument of redemption. Not just they become redeemed, they become an instrument of the redemption. Okay. It is generally known that when something is pashut, it is stripped of outside attachments and stands independently. Okay, that's what we were saying. It follows then that the one who is singled out for redemption can have no connection to a master. For it to be considered pashut, the person must not be subordinate to one who rules over him. For freedom and redemption are one thing. As it says, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So you see that the idea of going out of Egypt and out of slavery is one and the same idea, of course. So freedom and redemption are one. So to be redeemed is to have no master. At least it's a condition precedent that a person has to have in order to be truly redeemed. Therefore, it is as clear as day that when things are interconnected, they are subjugated to each other and no part is deemed free. This is the opposite of matzah, the unleavened bread that we eat on Passover, the holiday of our freedom. So even though leavened bread is richer, but because it's dependent on the leavening agent to make it rise, it lacks in a certain symbolic, element of freedom. It's dependent on another. There's this famous Rashi in the Torah in the parsha about Noah, that says that the dove, returned to Noah with an olive branch, famously with an olive branch in its beak. So Rashi comments, why an olive branch? Why not some other branch? What was the point of the olive branch? So he says olives are bitter. And the dove was telling Noah, I'd rather make my own living bitterly than take handouts from you. And at the next time she went out, she didn't come back. So, but I've always been, I found the message very profound because it's a hard one also in this generation where people, entitlements are so common, but the point of what is similar to this point is that the dove was saying better that I should, have my sustenance and livelihood on my own, struggling and through difficulty like the matzah, which is flat and a bit hard and doesn't have assistance. Better to have a simple, live in a poor livelihood and not take from others. That's basically what she was saying. And it's a quote from the sages, saying that the dove was representing this good trait that a person should have. Okay, so I think there's a similarity there to what we're saying here, the idea of being redeemed and being independent and not reliant on others or interconnected. And the fact of the matter is that this also brings out the interconnectedness or the relationship between the spiritual and the physical, because, what are we even talking about here? Why are we talking about, a person being dependent on other things? Should be a spiritual question. Does the person feel, dependent on God or not? But it seems, obviously, that's the number one most important issue. I can work for my boss, or any of us can be reliant, whether it's on customers, whether it's on an employer. But if I know that in reality that it's all coming from the Almighty, then certainly spiritually speaking, and even emotionally speaking, I'm not dependent because I know where my sustenance is really coming from, and I don't feel, subservient to this person, or dependent on the employer, customers, whatever it may be. But we seem to be saying here that even if a person is financially dependent on others, that's also problematic in terms of redemption. And you see that in Egypt. not only had a spiritual enlightenment, but they also had all their needs met. They weren't dependent on other nations. So the redemption was a complete one, because the fact of the matter is, if we're dependent on others for our physical needs, it's extremely difficult, if not so impossible, to fully, through and through, really be, independent in thought and independent in our deeds. Because look, even if God is making us dependent on somebody, and we know, oh, it's coming from God, but if that individual wants us to behave in a certain way, and if not, we are afraid we may lose that contract, we may lose that job, very difficult test then, pushing us towards, at the very least, keeping our opinions quiet, keeping our conduct quiet in ways that they may not approve of. So that's not really being free. I've often told my wife, actually, we live in a free country, and to be honest, often I've said, I don't know, if you have an employer, I'm not sure if you really live in a free country. At the end of the day, you're dependent on them, and you can't say what they don't want you to say, and you just feel there's a lot of tremendous dependency. So, and so many of the person's hours are in that environment in which they're not free and independent. They're subservient. So in any event, I think, so in the time to come, that won't be the case. We won't be dependent. Certainly the righteous are not going to be dependent on anybody else. And as the Zohar says, it's be the ignoramuses that'll be dependent on the Torah scholars. But, to take that a metaphor or that idea further, I think, the point is that Israel will be settled and independent militarily, financially, spiritually, and those that surround Israel will similarly enjoy those same benefits. But that's not how we live today. Okay, so today we have to struggle with these things and try to, and the best of our ability, spiritually, to feel brave, spiritually, psychologically, to be as independent as we can under the circumstances. And that's a tremendous heroic thing. So back to this point here. So we seem to be, so Rabbi Chlorophene and Rabbi Katz here are saying that the ger has this element. Now, if you think about it, what is he talking about? What is the element that the ger or the Noahide has to have of independence? I think it's quite clear. I mean, as far as independence or being not connected to certain influences or relationships. I mean, clearly what they're saying, he's saying is, first and foremost, is those influence from the person's history that were, counter to Torah. Person often is, cuts off those type of ties, certainly distances themselves from those type of ties, particularly if they belong to a certain, different religious group. Obviously, those ties are completely cut. With family, those ties are not cut. And we have had discussions about that, how halachically the Torah law understands that a Noahide should continue those relationships, and there's a certain leniency in terms of Noahide continuing his relationships with his non-Noahide relatives and community members. But still, there's clearly a very big element of exiting and leaving things behind and throwing things overboard when someone becomes a ben Noach. Okay. So again, he was talking about the matzah, how that's unleavened, and that's part of being free is not being interconnected. Now, last paragraph on page 36. In and of itself, matzah is pashut, free from the addition of other elements. It contains nothing but flour and water, and is kneaded, rolled out, and baked. Conversely, leavened bread, i.e. chametz, in addition to flour and water, is combined with or leavening, which attaches itself to every grain of flour, causing the dough to rise. As a result, the grains are not free, but under the influence of null leavening. Similarly, when one is subjugated to a master, he has not attained freedom. And freedom is the ingredient through which redemption was created. So redemption comes through freedom. The person has a master, then they can't reach redemption. So in other words, what we're saying here is something similar to also what we say in the Shema prayer. And that is, if a person is subservient to something outside of God, then he's not subservient to God at the end of the day. Again, there's so many levels of this. Again, it's a person can be a observing Jew, for example, and have an employer and feel very subservient to that employer. So there's a nuance, and there's different ratio of degrees. But at the end of the day, as the verse says in the Shema, it's to guard yourself and be careful that you do not turn away and worship other gods. So the idea is that if a person turns away, is worshiping other gods, turns away and worships other gods, they're not worshiping God. So basically, again, been coming back to the same idea that freedom, which is more a physical type of a term, or maybe a psychological term, is related to, you have to have that first before we can get to the spiritual levels of redemption. I guess you could say that's one of the arguments people might make for the state of Israel, being related to the redemption. Now, in Chabad, we don't agree with this, but and I think that's because that the Rebbe wanted to, how should I say, sort of, the Rebbe didn't want to settle with the state of Israel being a redemption. The Talmud says that if the Jewish people merit, then the final redemption will be miraculous. If the Jewish people don't merit, it'll be more natural. I don't think the Rebbe wanted to accept, and also other tzaddikim before him, that the redemption is going to just be natural, and that the Jewish people won't merit a miraculous redemption, or that even the world won't merit a miraculous redemption, which will be so much a greater sanctification of God's name, and will uplift the Jewish people and righteousness so much more. So I think, in other words, what I'm saying is, I think that the Rebbe believed and felt that a physical redemption is a letdown. And he actually said, I think the previous Rebbe said that this is not, this is not what should have happened after the Holocaust. We should have had the full redemption. This is not, this is not a real redemption. So in any event, but nevertheless, the point is, though, still remains that we need a physical redemption, meaning to say a physical freedom from the kingdoms of the nations, in order for Israel then also to have a spiritual redemption. As long as Israel is dependent on nations of the world, and certainly is subjugated by nations of the world, they can't have a full spiritual redemption either. So look, this is something we can take in our own lives, that it's important to seek also as best as we can a physical redemption, meaning to say to be independent if we can financially, so that we can practice our beliefs without interference from forces that may interfere, that may disagree, and make it more difficult for us to express ourselves. Okay, let's continue. Prerequisites for the ger to maintain freedom are 3. So it looks like, so we're going to focus on the spiritual aspects of freedom, I think, also here. So he says, number 1, the ger must use wisdom to avoid the traps that may be spread for him and that he spreads for himself. Therefore, he must learn wisdom. Okay, so first of all, the ger has to be wise. All right, it's a very general statement. How does someone gain wisdom? How do you know if we're making a wise decision or not? It seems like we have to get advice. Okay, let's see number 2. The ger must have the courage to break every yoke other than God's. This begins with breaking the yoke of idolatry, but continues throughout life as a protection against trading in one trap for another. Number 3, the ger must learn to trust his teacher. I think 1 and 3 are related. But I would guess that number 1 is me speaking about Torah study. Person gains wisdom through Torah study. Number 2 is making sure that person doesn't have dual loyalties, I guess, so to speak, or different again, addictions and different worshiping different things. And 3 is finally faith, trust in the teacher. Now, the next paragraph is very, very important. It's really, it's a very inspirational paragraph. And it says a very similar thing in Tana de Eliyahu, which is a famous statement, a kind of midrash, says a very, very similar thing. Let's see what Rabbi Joseph Gekatlia of blessed memory said. He taught that any person whose heart is given over to perfecting his character traits, who straightens his path and his deeds, and pursues humility to the ultimate, so that when he is insulted, he does not return the insult, and when he hears himself being shamed, he does not answer, immediately the Shekhinah, the divine presence, in other words, rests upon him, and he does not need to learn from a person of flesh and blood, for the Spirit of God teaches him. So this is quite amazing. It's very similar to the Tana of Eliyahu that says that the divine presence can rest on both Jew and Gentile, even a maidservant, if they correct their character and they take upon themselves the yoke of heaven, etc. It's a very famous statement. And this follows along. But what's also amazing about Rabbi Gekatlia's statement is that he's focusing particularly on perfecting character. He doesn't make any mention of the ritualistic, so to speak, commandments that are more Jew exclusive, I could say. He's talking about character, perfecting character and being humble and correcting one's deeds, without specifically mentioning anything about, holiness, certainly nothing about any of the mitzvot, commandments between man and God that so identify, Jewish practice. Instead, the focus is on, again, perfecting character, path and deeds, pursuing humility. So, I've said this many times, and again, we're seeing it once again, that these really are the main, they're the main path for both Jew and Ben Noach, is to focus on character, to focus on fear of God, love of God, to the extent it affects a person's character and how they deal with others, and humility. These are the things that are really constant. And you can even say that a real approach to the laws between man and God help the character. In other words, if a person makes blessings, they're thinking of God, if they're really internalizing what they're doing, it's going to bring to greater humility, and it works to buttress and assist a person in perfecting their character and acting in a better way towards their fellow man. But this is it. This is it. So you see, the 7 laws are quite enough to encompass, particularly if it's done strictly, if it's done scrupulously, and when it comes to character perfection, there really is no end to the work that could be done and needs to be done, to working on humility, to working on faith, because as it says in particularly Hasidic works, but also ethical works, and I think all over in from what I understand in Breslov writing, it's all over the place. That it's also in Tanya, that whatever happens to us, if we have strong faith, then if someone insults us, if somebody in some way assaults us, so to speak, in whatever way, they cause us some kind of injury, emotional or financial or whatever it is, there's an understanding that in the end of the day that it couldn't have happened if God didn't want it to happen. And therefore to accept it with happiness, and certainly to accept it with meaning, and not to lash out at the person, because in any event it has to do with me. It's my business, really. And to take it with humility and silently, and to try to encourage peace. Yeah, sometimes there is a place for response. The person doesn't want to just give in to abuse. But in many situations, the other person is just overwhelmed, in a bad mood, having their own problems, and instead of lashing out against them, we can be patient and realize that, why am I the one in this situation? Why am I the one who got caught, when this person was upset and angry or something because of other things? This is clearly from heaven. that I was, destined to be in this situation, and I should be quiet and be patient and maybe even try to help this person. So, there's just so much to do, and it's not just like the idea of learning a new idea or a new Rashi or a new intellectual idea, but the point is the need to continuously work on it, to internalize it, because we're so naturally different. We're so naturally, sensitive and self-centered and ego-centered that it's a lot of work to turn that around and to really have this patience and really, first of all, get to the point where we're not just forcing it and we actually feel the patience and we actually, until we get to the point when we're insulted by the other person, and instead of feeling angry, we're just wondering, we're not even thinking about ourselves, we're just wondering, what is this person really so upset about? What can I do to help? Then we haven't even reached anything yet. And that's a high level, right? The level of we're not even thinking about ourselves, we're just thinking about the other person, even when we're hurt. But that's something that's attainable. It's something that we can accomplish. Certainly with the people we love, I don't think it's too much to ask. Right? I don't think so. Anyway, so this is an incredible statement here. If we work on our character and we reach high levels of humility, the divine presence will rest on any person who does these things, and lead them. The Spirit of God will then lead them in the right direction in terms of their ideas of what to do and how to live their life. I guess I do have to add to that if a person is ignorant in Torah, it's not, I don't know if it's a little hard to do. I think this has to be understood on the backdrop that the person also has Torah knowledge. You have Torah knowledge and you're humble, so you're not going to misuse the knowledge you have. You have to have some guideline. You have to have some direction of what proper behavior is. You can't just be humble and just know exactly what to do. So they have to have some guidebook, some GPS. So it seems to me that that's Torah learning. A person learns Torah. For example, someone learns the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, with the Midrashim and with Rashi, and understands all the talk about, proper behavior that's found there, or learns ethics of the fathers, etc., and so on and so forth, and then practices it and really works to make it, really internalize it, then the person is going to know, then the Spirit of God will rest on them and they'll know exactly what to do. But the point is, if we sit back and we don't study in terms of how to behave, and we don't have any basic, how do I say, just basic bare bones direction, compass, that's it. If we don't have the basic compass, we can't really expect God is just going to do some miracle and come down, rest on us, and then tell us what to do. We have to first seek it out first. So I just would like to add that studying Torah with proper character and humility, then Hashem will direct you in the right path. Okay, page 38. Therefore, the Rambam taught that in the Messianic era, the occupation of the entire world will be solely to know God. As it says, the world will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as water fills the sea. It says famously in Isaiah 11. And that's what we're all waiting for. Of course, knowledge of God is our means of becoming close to God. God isn't a physical thing that we can drive to meet him. The way we come close to him is with our knowledge of him. The more we know of him, the closer we are. Okay, last paragraph here. A ger who lives outside the land of Israel is half a ger, for it takes the land of Israel to complete the soul of a ger. But if one cannot live in the land, he can yearn for it, pray for it, learn to read and pronounce biblical Hebrew, and make his world a little corner of Israel. If he does this, with Hashem's help, he will accomplish what he needs to accomplish. He can rely on this, for Moses, a ger, lived outside the land. So in other words, if a person yearns for the land and everything it represents, then similar to Moses, who was also a stranger who lived his whole life in the desert and never entered the land, a person can reach that level and connect to Moses and still, in other words, connect with God and fully fulfill his spiritual purpose, even though he never enters the land of Israel, if that's just not something a person can do. So yeah, it's an integral part of Jewish belief to feel a connection with the land of Israel. Many people do it by giving charity to the land and things like that. People have charity boxes giving to the poor of the land of Israel. But I think there's more to it. I understand in Chabad Hasidic thought, just the word Jerusalem refers to the perfect fear, Yareh. Yeru is the same letters as Yirah, which is fear, the fear and awe of God. So and Shalem and Jerusalem, Shalem is complete. So it's the complete fear of God is what Jerusalem is really in a spiritual sense all about. And I think Rav Nachman says that the land of Israel is connected with perfect faith in God and the belief in miracles and the belief in the power of prayer. So I think it's also interconnected to what we said before, which was that the land of Israel is a place that is independent of idolatry. It's the land in which was made for serving God, the land in which the temple was destined and stood there. It's a land for the service of God. It's a godly environment. So in other words, a person should make their own 4 cubits a place completely pure of any idolatry of any kind and any extraneous fears and desires of any kind. And that way, we can create our own Israel even here. Okay, so we finished, I think, the first chapter of World of the Ger. Now we'll do a little bit from the book of the Righteous Gentile. I think we were doing courts of law. I think we got up to number 9. I'm going to start number 10. In my version, it's on page 102. Says, it is forbidden for a court to have compassion on a murderer, saying that since one person has already been killed, what purpose could there be in killing another? And the court may not delay the execution because of compassion. And so if someone was convicted, again, based on witnesses, of murder, then he has to be put to death. Number 11. Similarly, in financial litigation, the court may not have mercy on a poor person, taking the attitude that a rich plaintiff has an obligation to support the poor, therefore finding for the poor defendant so that he will be supported with an honorable livelihood. Also not permitted. So you see the very, very strong attitude in Judaism of the rule of law and objective legal rulings. We don't look at where the person is. We look at what the objective ruling should be and what was fair in this circumstance. It doesn't matter the person otherwise is poor, otherwise is rich. It's not the issue. The issue is over here. Who owes who money? Who behaved correctly in this business transaction and who didn't? That's the issue. So we can't look at poor or rich or anything else. Okay? So again, it's very similar, and you could really say that I think that the American system of the idea of the rule of law was something that you see in Torah law thousands of years ago. The idea that you have to just look at the law, you're not allowed to look at any other extraneous circumstances when you make your decision, whether they're political, social, or otherwise. Okay, paragraph 12 on page 103. It is similarly forbidden to pay prejudicial respect to a great person. You can't pay respect, in other words, when there are two litigants, I think you're talking about this case, two litigants, you can't give more honor to one litigant. In other words, the judge can't show honor to one litigant over another. If two litigants appear in court, one a great wise man and the other a simple person, the judge may not ask about the welfare of the great one, nor express pleasure at being in his presence in any way, nor give him honor in any way. Otherwise, the arguments of the simple person will be stifled. He would think, what's the use anyway? Judge must not favor either party until judgment is finished. And the sages warn that a judge must not think that since a litigant is so great a person, it is unseemly to embarrass him or see him in his embarrassment. So, yeah, I got to tell you, you probably know I'm an attorney. And when I come to court and my adversary, the other lawyer for the other side, says, hey, hi, Judge, how you doing? The judge's like, hey, how are you? Good seeing you again. It just doesn't, it's like, okay, you already feel that you're of the short end of the stick. You haven't even started, and the other person has a warm relationship with the judge. So I think that the Torah is saying that's not allowed. You can't do that, even though an attorney is not a litigant, but he's representing a litigant. And so how can we dispute this properly when the judge has already shown favor to one of the people? It doesn't matter the reason. The reason is because he sees him in court all the time. But it's difficult, and really the judge has to step back and not keep a distance from the lawyers and the litigants. In the American system, it's hard because the lawyers and judges mingle socially, so they get to be friends. And I think it's kind of a little. The truth is that they seem most of the time quite fair, but nevertheless, I think it can make a lawyer feel a bit, like he's not on equal footing. If you come in and the other lawyer is having a conversation with the judge and talking about, their places in the Hamptons or whatever it is, and you're not part of that crowd, and you see that they're buddies, it's not good. It kind of just takes your wind right out of your sails, Anyway, okay, back to this. So, but the point is, that's what they're talking about here, is that there's this understanding, the sensitivity that just small things, just a little talk, a little smile from the judge towards one litigant can ruin the entire case. That's what we're saying here. Okay. And what the sages are teaching here is that you might think that since the wealthy person or well-to-do person is used to getting honor, and if you don't treat him so, for him, that's not the normal way of being treated. So you might think that the judge, should give him the honor that he usually attains. But the lesson is no, you can't, because they have to be treated completely equally. Okay. Paragraph 13. If two litigants appear in court, and one is a righteous person while the other is a wicked person, the judge should not presume that the wicked person will not tell the truth, or presume that he will not change his ways, and therefore the judgment should go against him. So even if one person is known to be wicked, even then, the law has to be blind and give the person a chance. Don't assume that he's going to continue in his wicked ways. Again, rule of law based on the circumstances, not based on the people before us, but based on what the law should be, based on what happened. 14. One should not judge unrighteously, acquitting the guilty and condemning the innocent. And a judge who delays the judgment, lengthening the time of the testimony or cross-examination in order to cause either the litigants to suffer, falls under the ruling of judging unrighteously. So in other words, there's two types of judging unrighteously. This is kind of similar to a secular law. One is the ruling is wrong. The ruling is not right. You found someone who was a thief. You found him, not liable, for example. Someone was negligent and you say they're not responsible. So that's clearly what? A wrong decision, an unrighteous ruling. But there's also something else, and that is unrighteous procedure. Using a system to harm one of the litigants by schlepping it out, dragging it out, or making him provide more evidence, things like that. Corrupting the procedure. That's another form of unrighteous law, an unrighteous judging and adjudication. So in other words, the judge, the litigant may get lucky and still win, but the means, the way it came about, the judge, it wasn't even-handed, and that's not right. So that's also unrighteous. He gives an example here of lengthening the time of the testimony to cause the litigants to suffer. Okay, 15. One who judges haughtily, without fearing his awesome responsibility and without due deliberation, and then comes to a decision quickly before he has taken the time to carefully consider the case, is considered stupid, wicked, and coarsely egotistical. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. Point is that there has to be due deliberation to decide a case, not to jump to a decision because the person has, baseless, self-confidence, to quickly rush to a decision or an arbitrary decision, whatever first comes to the person's mind. Either way, person's stupid and wicked and coarsely egotistical. 16. The court should not establish a standard judgment by which numerous cases may be judged according to a precedent system, but should consider each case individually on its own unique merits. Note, precedent in legal cases may be followed as guidelines, however. So it's very interesting because the whole idea of halacha is precedent. Isn't it? Basically halacha says, when X does such and Y does such, then the ruling is, Z. So, isn't that precedent? It's always precedent, isn't it? Well, we're just saying that every case has to be examined carefully and all details taken into consideration. And we shouldn't assume just because certain things line up that it's the same as the previous case. We have to think about all the circumstances carefully, because this could be a little different in some way. There can be some exception. And as he continues, sure, precedent is something to examine, but it's not automatic. Just because the previous case was very similar, that this one should have the same ruling. 17, on page 104. A case concerning a large sum of money and a case concerning a small amount of money should be given equal and individual consideration. Now, this is something that is hard for courts to do, to be honest. I think, particularly, and also it's because of lawyers, also because lawyers get paid, and if the case isn't worth it, they don't want to take the case, right? If it's an argument over $5, you have to, nobody wants to hear that case, to tell you the truth. In the secular legal courts, nobody wants you to bring a $5 case to small claims court. The judge is going to just, I think, anyway, I could be wrong, but the judge's attitude will be, you've got to be kidding me. You couldn't figure this out? I'm sitting here for $5? But the Torah doesn't agree with that. Whatever it is, it's a law and you have a right to be adjudicated. It's not my business how much it is. For you, it's your property. It's sacred to you. It's not my right to say, oh, just, work it out, or it's not important enough. That's the wrong approach. That's what we're saying. So it's very profound and very important, I think, in a lot of ways, because it represents the idea that what's important is the law, meaning to say to have justice, big or small, doesn't matter. What's correct and true in this situation, in this relationship between these two people is correct and true. It doesn't matter how much money it is. It's not like we don't have time for this. This is too small. So that doesn't play a role in Jewish law. At least theoretically speaking, it certainly doesn't. Okay. 18. It is a positive commandment to deliver a righteous judgment, treating the two claimants equally in every respect. So the person, fulfills a positive commandment of the Torah if they adjudicate righteously. The judge may not permit one to explain his case at great length while telling the other to keep his words brief. Nor should the judge be pleasant and smile at one while being short and gruff to the other. So this is something we mentioned before. It's very similar to the previous statement about the rich person, the honorable man, is you're not allowed to treat the litigants differently. 19, a judge is forbidden to take a bribe. Bribery will certainly corrupt any judgment. A judge who takes a bribe is obligated to return the bribe if the giver demands it. Okay. So there's two items. First of all, a judge who takes a bribe is not allowed to be a judge on the case anymore. And second of all, he has to return it if the giver wants it back. 20. It is also forbidden to offer a bribe to a judge. The category of bribery is not limited to money, but includes any type of gift or favor. Finally, the last paragraph for tonight, 21. Any judge who sits in judgment and attempts to magnify his importance, even in order to increase the wages of his bailiff or the court clerk, is in the category of one who leans after the wrong things. Once a judge was entering a boat to cross a river. A man who had a case in litigation before the judge was on the boat and stretched out his hand to help the judge aboard. The judge told him, "Behold, I am disqualified to judge your case." So in other words, the judge went so far in feeling that this could be similar to a bribe, that if you help me on the boat, I already may lean towards your side, and I'm not going to judge your case anymore. The first part of 21 seems to be talking about I guess the judge who somehow is trying to make himself look more important than he actually is, even if it's for the good of his staff. That's not the way to treat the public. Okay. Questions, comments? We finished pretty much on time today. That doesn't usually happen. So take advantage. You can ask questions before you get too tired tonight. Usually I pull this trick where I keep going late, figuring, they'll be too tired to ask questions. But tonight it's earlier, so I see there aren't that many people, so, no. So any comments or questions or anything? All right. Some of these things on judging is a little hypothetical because nobody's judges here. But still, it's worth knowing. It's worth understanding what a Torah system of justice would look like. And obviously, the idea is, in general in Judaism, is that religion isn't just for an individual to walk around quietly and keep, but it's for an entire community, an entire society. And societies need courts of justice, probably even more than they need other forms of government. Because the question is, what do you do when there's a dispute? We see in the book of Judges that at that time, the children of Israel only had leaders when there was a crisis. But if there was no crisis, there was no leaders. Now we have it the other way around. We have leaders that create a crisis, but they don't come about from the crisis. They create the crisis. Anyway, but the point is that, no, but seriously, because the idea of a leader is to solve a crisis. So if there isn't a crisis, they have to find one to fix it. And so it kind of makes sense that maybe it's just better not to have a leader until you have a crisis and there's something to fix. Let them fix it. Otherwise, we don't need them. Anyway, as it's well known, Samuel rebuked the people for wanting a king but never rebuked them for wanting judges. And obviously, judges is something that Moses sat and judged the people in the desert, and judges is something that the Jewish people always have to have. And so too, then therefore the nations may know always have to have. You can have a king, you can have a Congress, yes, no, it's up to you. But in terms of judges, that's something that must be present, because we can't allow injustice. And we can't allow a situation in which there'll be, an inability to deal with a dispute, or if a person is being taken advantage of, they'll have nowhere to turn. So, so a court system is an absolutely imperative, and it's an obligation, and we should keep that in mind in terms of how important the court system really is. Okay, last chance. All right. Okay, bye everyone. Have a good. Oh, one more thing about Benjamin. Just keeping in mind, people have sent. I really want to thank everyone who sent me funds to assist Benjamin. I really, really appreciate it. And he's received the money. I just assisted him with some money to buy new feed for his hens. And he sold all the eggs. Either they consumed them. He also sold the eggs to buy medicine because he had malaria, and he had to sell a lot of the eggs to get cash to buy medicine for himself. So that's what happened with that. And so unfortunately, therefore, he needed money outside of the business to buy new feed for the animals. The idea was to help him to get the chicken so that he could, stand on his own 2 feet. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet. So anyway, so that's something that I helped him with. If you want to assist me with that, that would be nice. You don't have to, but I'm sure there's going to be soon other things coming up. It's a very sad situation. I like to try to help wean him off this and give him a way to support himself. We have to. I have to find a way. I don't want to continue. It's not, obviously it's not a way to live, to have to be dependent, as we were talking, dependent on others for your whole life, but very difficult there. It's a difficult situation. Okay. Again, thank you. Have a good night. Laila tov. Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Boom.